Margaret Ellison did not cry when her mother pressed a tray of champagne into her hands in the middle of her own sister's engagement party. She did not cry when Vanessa raised her glass before 200 guests, turned her eyes toward the girl standing pressed against the far wall, and said in a voice as sweet as honey that her little sister was better suited to carrying trays than sitting at the table. Anyone could see that plainly. The whole room laughed. Maggie only pressed her lips together, kept the wine in those fragile glasses from rippling so much as once, lifted the tray to the height of her shoulder, and walked back into the crowd with her spine perfectly straight and a quiet wound bleeding somewhere beneath her ribs. She had lived invisibly for all 28 years of her life. She had learned to become a faint shadow in her own home, learned to swallow every bitter word until she no longer felt its sharp edges going down. But tonight something was different. From a table in the farthest corner of the hall, the one table no guest dared approach a man with broad shoulders and eyes cold, as tempered steel was quietly watching her, and the whole evening through, no matter where she went, he did not look away even once. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, so that no story of quiet courage is ever forgotten. The kitchen of the Ravensworth Hotel was tucked away behind 2 heavy wooden doors, and when Maggie stepped through them, the laughter of 200 guests seemed to soften at once, as if someone had lowered the volume on the entire outside world. Here, there was only the smell of melted butter, the clatter of pots knocking together, and the heat rising from ovens glowing red with fire. She set the empty tray down on the steel counter, pressed both palms flat against the cool metal, and allowed herself to breathe out a long breath she had been holding inside her chest all evening. No one in that ballroom knew that the girl carrying champagne for them had just swallowed something more bitter than any drop of wine on her tray. Rosa Mendez stood beside the sink, a 52-year-old woman with hands hardened by 30 years in kitchens and a face accustomed to seeing everything while never saying a word. She looked up, glanced at Maggie for a moment, then quietly took a plate wrapped tightly in foil from the bottom drawer of the refrigerator. "I saved this for you from the beginning of the shift," Rosa said, her voice low and slow like water moving over river stones. "They're serving grilled shrimp and lamb, but I knew you hadn't eaten anything since morning." Maggie looked at the plate, then at the woman who had pushed it into her hands, and for one brief moment she couldn't believe her throat could tighten so painfully over such a small act of kindness. "You didn't have to do that, Rosa." "I wanted to," the older woman answered simply, as though it were the most obvious thing in the world, then turned back to the stack of dishes waiting to be washed. Maggie sat down on the stool in the corner, peeled back the foil, and ate in silence. Out there, people were raising glasses to celebrate her sister's upcoming marriage into one of the wealthiest families in Chicago, while here, in a kitchen heavy with the smell of grease, she was being treated with more kindness by an almost stranger than her own mother had shown her in the past 3 years. The banquet manager walked in with a crumpled stack of invoices in his hand, his face drawn into a scowl. "The wine supplier got the numbers wrong again," he muttered, tossing the papers onto the table, right beside where Maggie sat. "I've paid them 3 times this month, and the numbers still don't match. I could spend the whole evening on this and still not find it." Maggie glanced at the top invoice almost by reflex, her eyes moving across the dense rows of tiny figures. "You overpaid them $412, she said softly, without even pausing her hand. "They charged the delivery fee twice, on the 9th line and the 23rd line, then added the tax on the red wine crate incorrectly into the final total. Fix those 3 spots, and the number will match." The kitchen went still for a beat. The manager picked up the invoice, checked the exact lines she had mentioned, and his eyebrows rose higher and higher. "You're right," he blurted, startled and relieved at the same time. "How did you see that so fast?" Maggie only shrugged and set her empty plate down on the table. "I studied accounting once," she replied, and said nothing more, because the story of how she had been forced to quit in her final year when her family ran out of money was something she never told anyone. Rosa, from her place by the sink, turned to look at her with an expression that was hard to name. Part sorrow, part something shining almost like respect. "Numbers never lie," Maggie added, almost to herself, wiping her hands on her apron. "People can lie to you with words, with smiles, with the way they pretend you don't exist. But numbers are always honest. As long as you're willing to look closely enough, they'll tell you the whole truth no one wants you to know." The manager thanked her over and over, then hurried back out, clutching the stack of invoices as though he had just been handed a treasure. Rosa dried her hands, stepped closer, and placed a warm palm on the young woman's shoulder. "You have something that everyone in that ballroom put together doesn't have," she said. "They just aren't kind enough to see it." Maggie looked up, and for the first time in that long, endless evening, the corner of her mouth moved into the smallest smile, fragile but real, lit from somewhere deep inside her that she had thought had gone cold long ago. That small smile, so fragile it almost seemed not to exist at all, carried Maggie back to another room in another moment of her life, a place where there had once been a man who had always seen her more clearly than anyone else in the world. Walter Ellison was a gentle accountant, with hair that had turned silver too soon, and tortoiseshell glasses that were always slipping down the bridge of his nose, a man who had spent his whole life bent patiently over ledgers and columns of figures that other people found dull, but that he found strangely beautiful. On evenings, when Maggie was still a little girl, he would draw her close to the wooden table in their small house on Lakewood Street, take an old pocket calculator from the breast pocket of his shirt, its keys worn smooth and shiny from years of use, and teach her how numbers lined themselves up, and then told a story. "Do you see, Maggie?" he used to say, tapping one fingertip lightly against the tiny screen of the calculator. "People can hide the truth in words as much as they want, but they can never hide it in numbers, because numbers are the only things in this world that don't know how to lie." Little Maggie could do calculations in her head that her classmates needed pencil and paper to solve, and every time she got one right, he would look at her over those slipping glasses with the radiant eyes of a father who knew his daughter had inherited the very best part of him. Her older sister Vanessa was taken by their mother to piano lessons and dance classes, while Maggie sat beside her father learning how to read a balance sheet, and she never once felt deprived, because she had him, and he had her, and that was enough. Then one October morning, when Maggie had just turned 25 and was in her final year studying accounting at the university, he collapsed beside that familiar desk, the pocket calculator still lying open in his palm, and a stroke took him before the ambulance could arrive, sudden and cruel as a door slamming shut in the middle of an unfinished sentence. He left without any clear instructions about his assets, without a properly witnessed will, only scattered papers tucked in drawers that he had always believed he still had many years to organize neatly. In the blurred weeks after the funeral, while Maggie still hadn't had time to understand that the only person who had truly seen her was gone forever, everything in the house began to shift quietly along new lines she didn't even know were being drawn. Her mother, Catherine, who had always regarded Vanessa as the precious jewel of the family, and Maggie as the awkward, overweight daughter who didn't know how to bring honor to their name, now took hold of every decision with the cold calm of someone rearranging furniture in a room. Maggie had to abandon her final year of school when her mother announced that the family no longer had enough money for both sisters, and of course the one expected to sacrifice was Maggie, never Vanessa. Little by little, through hundreds of tiny decisions, not one of them large enough for her to stand up and fight against, she was pushed from the place of a daughter in the home into the role of the one who handled chores, the cleaner, the errand runner, the person whose presence was remembered only when something needed to be done. She didn't weep. She didn't argue. She had learned very early that tears were a luxury someone in her position couldn't afford. The only thing she kept from the old house on Lakewood Street, when her mother sold it to gather money for Vanessa's future, was her father's pocket calculator, with its smooth, worn keys still holding the memory of his fingerprints, and she kept it in the drawer beside her bed, the way someone might keep a piece of a heart that had stopped beating, but somehow still remained warm. When Maggie returned to the ballroom with a fresh tray brimming with champagne in her hands, she knew at once that the atmosphere in the room had changed in a way she couldn't quite name, but could feel clearly along every nerve in her body. The laughter and conversation were still there, but they had dropped by half a note. The idle chatter had grown more restrained, and the crowd that had once been scattered across the hall now drifted unconsciously to either side, like water parting before the prow of a great ship. She followed the direction of the glances being stolen toward one side of the room, and she understood the reason. The man at the table in the farthest corner, the one who had been watching her without looking away since the beginning of the evening, had now risen to his feet and begun moving slowly through the room, and that entire gathering of wealthy, polished people made way for him automatically, as if they had long been taught that this was something they were required to do. Maggie heard fragments of whispers breaking around her as she stood still beside the wall with the tray in her hands, and little by little the pieces came together into a picture that sent a chill down her spine. "That is Graham Holloway," one man whispered to the person beside him in a voice filled with both respect and a trace of fear. "The biggest real estate magnate in Chicago, the man who owns half the skyscrapers along the lakeshore and holds in his hands deals no one dares ask too many questions about. A woman in a red velvet gown murmured to her friend that people said he could make a thriving company collapse with a single phone call, and could also lift a penniless man into a millionaire if the mood struck him, that those who had ever dared betray him had quietly vanished from this upper world, without a single soul willing to speak their names again. There were men in the room who stepped forward to greet him with strained smiles and slightly trembling hands, longing for a nod from him as though begging for a favor, while still keeping a safe distance, like people standing close to something both precious and dangerous. Catherine, Maggie's mother, was the quickest of all to recognize an opportunity, and Maggie saw her adjust her posture at once, pushing Vanessa gently forward with the brightest smile she could summon, because a man like Graham Holloway, single and powerful to that degree, was the prize every mother in that room longed to secure for her daughter. But the strange thing was that Graham answered those gestures of welcome with nothing more than a polite and distant nod, his gaze passing over beautiful Vanessa in her expensive silk dress, the way one passes over a decorative object that holds little real interest, then continuing on, and Maggie realized with a feeling that was part confusion and part unease that his path seemed to be leading toward her. She lowered her head, clinging to the old habit of someone who had spent her whole life surviving by becoming invisible, hoping that if she stood still enough and quietly enough, that gaze would slide past her the way it always had, the way every gaze in this room always had. But when she lifted her eyes again, he had stopped only a few steps away from her, and those eyes, cold as cooled steel, did not slide anywhere at all. They rested directly on her, calm and intent, as if in this crowded room filled with 200 glittering and powerful people, she was the only thing worth looking at. He said nothing, did not step any closer, only stood there watching her through a moment so long that Maggie could hear the pounding of her own heart in her ears, and then the corner of his mouth moved ever so slightly as though he were about to say something, before a shrill voice cut through everything and pulled the attention of the entire room in another direction. That shrill voice belonged to a man named Roland Beckett, a bulky investor with a heavy gold ring on his finger, standing in the middle of a circle of distinguished guests, and loudly presenting a real estate deal he was inviting everyone in the room to help fund. A lakeside complex project that, according to him, would bring enormous profits to anyone wise enough to get in right now. Maggie, who was moving along the edge of the group collecting empty glasses, had no intention of eavesdropping, but her ears had been trained since childhood to catch numbers in the air, the way a musician catches one wrong note in the middle of an entire orchestra. Roland Beckett was boasting about the total investment and the projected rate of return. He spoke of the construction floor area, the rental price per square meter. The payback period he promised would be only 4 short years, and every number he threw out made the guests around him nod and murmur in admiration. But in Maggie's mind, those numbers didn't line up into the beautiful story he wanted his listeners to believe. They formed something crooked, a row of figures that refused to fit together, a lie hidden carefully beneath the glossy surface of polished words. She stood still for a moment with the tray of empty glasses in her hands, running the calculation through her head once more to make certain she wasn't mistaken, and when she was sure, she faced a choice that had followed her all her life. She could lower her head, remain silent, and walk away the way an invisible person always did, or she could speak. She saw an older man standing at the edge of the group, a guest with a kind face, who was listening closely, and looked as though he was about to be persuaded, and she realized he was the one who would lose the most if he signed on to this deal. Maggie stepped closer to him, lowered her voice just enough for only him to hear, and said that if he intended to invest, he should ask to review the construction cost spreadsheet, because the total figure the other man had given was nearly 1/3 lower than reality, and with the floor area and rental price he had just mentioned, the payback period couldn't possibly be 4 years. It would have to be close to 9 years, which meant either he was hiding a debt somewhere, or he was deliberately inflating the profits to gather money from people too trusting to question him. The older man stared at her in stunned silence, then pulled a pen from his pocket and asked her to repeat those numbers. And the more he listened, the paler his face became, because she recited everything so smoothly and precisely that it couldn't have been a lucky guess from a waitress. What neither Maggie nor that man realized was that Graham Holloway was still standing only a few steps away, and he had heard every word she had just said. All evening, he had watched her the way one watches something one can't yet explain. But now his gaze had changed completely. It was no longer vague curiosity, but something sharp and alive. the look of a man who had just seen something precious hidden beneath a thing the entire room had already thrown away. He knew exactly what kind of man Roland Beckett was. He had already had his own doubts about that deal, but hadn't yet had the time to strip the numbers apart himself. And yet this girl carrying champagne had done it in only a few minutes of overhearing, with a calmness that made it seem like the simplest thing in the world. When the older man thanked her and hurried away to put distance between himself and Roland Beckett, Maggie looked up and met Graham's eyes once more. But this time she didn't lower her head out of habit, because there was something in the way he looked at her that made her feel, for the first time in her life, that she wasn't being examined. She was being seen. But that moment did not last long, because Roland Beckett had realized that the older man had just withdrawn from his deal after exchanging a few words with the waitress, and the rage of a man who had just lost his prey came crashing down on Maggie. He strode toward her with a face flushed red from wine and humiliation, loudly asking who she thought she was to interfere in grown men's business. What a lowly serving girl could possibly know about money that gave her the right to open her mouth? The group of guests around them turned to stare, and Maggie felt the familiar sensation of hundreds of eyes poring over her like needles, but she still stood straight and did not take even one step back. Roland Beckett, unable to bear the fact that someone he considered a servant had dared to look him directly in the eyes, grabbed a glass of red wine from the table and flung it straight onto her. The dark liquid spread across her white shirt and dripped down onto the gleaming floor, while he gave a sneering laugh and said that now she finally looked exactly like what she was, a clumsy little girl fit only for cleaning up messes. A few muffled giggles rose from somewhere in the crowd, and her mother and Vanessa stood not far away, neither of them stepping forward. They both simply turned their faces aside, as if they did not know the daughter standing soaked in wine in the middle of the room. Maggie did not cry. She only set the tray down on the nearest table with hands that remained steady, and in that very moment of humiliation, a deep, cold voice rose from behind her, cutting through the air like a steel blade. Graham Holloway stepped forward and stood between her and Roland Beckett, and he did not raise his voice, did not swing his hand. He only said in a calm voice so chilling it made the room shiver that in this entire room, the only person who had just proven she understood money was the woman he had thrown wine on, while he had just proven himself to be a fraud terrified of being exposed. The room fell deathly still. Even the music seemed to grow quieter, and Roland Beckett opened his mouth to argue, but Graham did not give him the chance. He went on to say that he had been watching that lakeside project for months and knew exactly how rotten the numbers inside it were, that from this moment forward, every bank and every investor he knew in Chicago would hear in full about the way Roland Beckett did business, and that by Monday morning, he would discover that not a single door in this city would still open for him. Roland Beckett's face shifted from flushed red to pale white, because he understood that this was not an empty threat but a sentence, and one word from Graham Holloway in this world carried more weight than any signed paper. Graham looked at him for another moment with eyes that held no anger, only cold contempt for men who made a habit of trampling those weaker than themselves, then turned his back on him as if he was no longer worth any concern, and Roland Beckett, under the gaze of the entire room, silently withdrew toward the door with the collapsed shoulders of a man who had just lost everything in the span of a few sentences. Graham removed his jacket, a jacket that must have been worth an entire month of Maggie's wages, and draped it over her wine-soaked shoulders with a gesture so natural that no one had time to react. Then he spoke to her in a voice that had softened greatly, just loud enough for only her to hear, saying that a person who knew how to see the truth in numbers should not be standing pressed against the wall in any room, and that she deserved far more than that. Late that night, long after the party had ended and the last guests had gone, Graham Holloway sat in the study on the top floor of the building that bore his name, where the entire city of Chicago stretched out beneath him like a quiet, glittering carpet of golden lights. In front of him, standing in the middle of the spacious room with 2 bodyguards silently keeping watch at the door, was a man named Dorian Vale, someone Graham had trusted and promoted for many years, someone he had once regarded almost like a brother. Graham did not raise his voice. He had never needed to raise his voice. He only pushed a thin folder sliding across the polished wooden desk toward the other man, and inside that folder was every piece of proof showing that Dorian had secretly sold Graham's information to a rival gang on the south side of the city in exchange for money and a promise of power. Dorian went pale, then began explaining himself and denying everything. But Graham simply sat still and listened with the frightening calm of a man who already knew every word that was about to be spoken. Then, when the other man fell silent, he said very softly that what disappointed him was not the betrayal, because in his world, betrayal was as ordinary as falling rain, but the fact that Dorian had believed he was foolish enough not to notice. He said he would do nothing to harm Dorian's body, because he was not that kind of man, but from tonight on, every door he had ever opened for him would be closed, every business connection he had gained through the Holloway name would disappear, and he would return to the same zero he had started from, so they could see whether that southern gang would still think he was worth anything once he had nothing left to sell. Dorian was quietly escorted out by the 2 bodyguards, and when the door closed, Graham rose and walked to the great glass window, looking down at the city where he had built his power from nothing but his own 2 hands. In that silence, an old memory surfaced inside him, and he couldn't stop it. He remembered his mother, a woman who had worked herself to the bone in the kitchens of Chicago's upper class for her entire life, a poor woman with hands cracked from dishwater, a woman who had once been treated by the wealthy people. She served as though she was not a human being at all, but only a useful object, mocked, dismissed, driven away, forgotten even while she was standing right in front of them. He remembered seeing her come home with red-rimmed eyes without ever explaining why. He remembered the silent vow he had made to himself, that one day he would become powerful enough that no one would ever dare treat a vulnerable person the way they had treated his mother, and that he would use that power to protect those who had no one to protect them. That was why tonight, when he saw the girl carrying champagne, standing soaked in red wine in the middle of a room full of people turning their faces away, he had not been able to sit still for one more second, because in the straight line of her back, and the eyes that refused to lower, he had seen something so familiar it made his chest ache. He returned to his desk, opened the file he had quietly ordered his people to gather that very night, and on the cover was a name written in neat handwriting, Margaret Ellison. Graham sat down, poured himself a glass of whiskey, and began to read. 3 days after the party, on an afternoon when Maggie returned to the family house on Hartwell Avenue after her shift, she accidentally overheard a conversation drifting out from the living room. One, her mother and sister had no idea she was home to hear. Catherine was sitting with Vanessa and a strange man in a gray suit, and spread across the table in front of them were stacks of papers, drawings, and figures that Maggie recognized at once as real estate valuation documents. She stood frozen at the threshold, and every word they spoke struck her ears like the blow of a hammer, because what they were discussing selling was not some unfamiliar asset, but the small house on Lakewood Street, the house where her father had lived his whole life, where he had taught her to read numbers beside the old wooden table, the only place left in the world that still held his warmth and his memory. Maggie had firmly believed that the house had been sold long ago, because her mother had lied to her that way in the years before, but it turned out Catherine had only rented it out and kept ownership, and now that Vanessa's wedding into a wealthy family was drawing near, and a large sum of money was needed for display, she had decided to sell it outright without caring at all that it was the last legacy of her late husband. The man in the gray suit nodded and said that, with that location, he could find a buyer within a month, and Vanessa gave a scornful little laugh and said the sooner the better, since it was only an old, shabby house anyway, hardly worth keeping for anything. It was that careless sentence from her sister that made something inside Maggie, something that had been compressed and buried for 3 long years, begin to crack. She stepped into the room and asked, in a voice she tried hard to keep calm, whether they were planning to sell her father's house, and Catherine looked up with the annoyance of someone being interrupted, answering that it was her property and she had every right to decide what to do with it, that Maggie had no standing to interfere, and that if she wasn't satisfied, she could go find herself somewhere else to live. Maggie looked at her mother, looked at her sister, looked at the valuation papers spread across the table, and for the first time in many years, she did not feel that familiar hurt rising in her throat. She felt something else entirely, a cold, steady calm taking root in the very place where her heart had just broken. She said nothing more. She only turned and walked up to her small room upstairs, closed the door, and sat down on the edge of the bed as darkness slowly began to fall. She pulled open the drawer beside her bed and took out her father's pocket calculator, the one with the worn, smooth keys that still seemed to hold the memory of his fingerprints, and she held it in her palm for a very long time, feeling its familiar weight, remembering his warm, deep voice beside her ear, telling her that numbers were the only things in the world that didn't know how to lie. And in that moment, sitting alone in the dark room with the last keepsake of her dead father in her hand, Maggie understood that she had endured enough, that lowering her head and becoming invisible had not saved anything for her, but had only made those people press farther and farther, and that if she continued to stay silent, they would take even this final piece of memory away from her. She turned the calculator on. The small screen lit up with an unfamiliar 0, and she whispered to it, as though whispering to her father, saying that this time she would not let them take anything else, that it was time for her to begin looking at the numbers people had not wanted her to see all these years, and that she would uncover the whole truth they had hidden from her. That night, when the whole house had fallen asleep, Maggie quietly went downstairs and opened the old filing cabinet in the study her father had left behind, the place where her mother kept important papers and rarely touched them. She searched by the weak light of the desk lamp, turning through one yellowed folder after another with trembling hands, not entirely because she was afraid of being discovered, but because a vague instinct was growing inside her, a feeling that something had been hidden from her all these years. And then she found it, a thin folder with pages that had begun to grow brittle with time. Inside were documents related to the accounting firm her father had built, a small but steady company that Maggie had always believed had gone bankrupt and shut down right after he died, because that was what her mother had told her. But the numbers before her eyes told an entirely different story, a story showing that the company had never gone bankrupt, that it had continued operating and earning steady profits under a new name, and that while her father was alive, he had owned the majority of its shares, an asset worth far more than anything she had ever imagined. Maggie's hands went cold as she turned to the next page and saw a share transfer document, and at the bottom of that page, beside her mother's signature and her sister's, was her own signature, the young, unsteady handwriting of a 25-year-old girl drowning in the grief of losing her father. In that moment, a memory she had buried and tried to forget suddenly rose back up with painful clarity, clear down to the smallest detail, the memory of those blurred days when she still couldn't understand that the only person who had truly loved her had gone forever. When her mind was numb and her heart was empty, she remembered her mother and sister handing her a stack of papers one morning, telling her they were only ordinary inheritance procedures that everyone had to sign so the family could get through a difficult time, that she didn't need to tire her mind by reading them because everything had already been properly handled by the family lawyer, that she only needed to sign in the places already marked so her mother could take care of everything for her. She had believed them, because at the time she no longer had the strength to doubt, no one left to lean on, and because she had still been naive enough to believe that, no matter what, they were her own flesh and blood. She had signed, page after page, without reading a single line, and that trembling stroke of her pen from years ago had handed the entire inheritance that should have belonged to her into the hands of her mother and sister, turning her from the rightful co-owner of her father's estate into someone with nothing, a daughter forced to serve tables for a living inside the very family that had stolen everything from her. Maggie sat frozen on the cold floor with the folder in her lap, and the truth laid bare before her eyes did not make her break down crying the way she had thought it would. Instead, it sent an icy chill running down her spine, because she realized that all those years of being treated like hired help, all those insults and moments of being forgotten, had not been some cruel twist of fate, but the result of a calculated deception. They had taken advantage of her grief, her trust, and her innocence to seize what her father had left behind, and then they had kept her in the house like a servant, so she would never have the chance to realize what had been taken from her. She ran her finger over her trembling signature on the page, and this time, when she lifted her head in the dark room, her eyes no longer carried the sorrow of a victim. They shone with the sharp, clear coldness of someone who had just found the first piece of the path toward reclaiming justice for herself. The next morning, Maggie received a small card sent to her workplace. It carried no sender's name, only an address, and a neat handwritten line inviting her to come for a meeting that afternoon. An instinct told her there was only one person in this city who would have a reason to seek her out that way. When she stepped into the office high up in the Holloway building, Graham was already waiting for her, and without any polite circling around the matter, he invited her to sit, then placed a folder on the table in front of her, saying that he owed her an explanation for why he had his people look into her family. He told her that for many months, he had been quietly tracking a loan sharking ring operating on the south side of the city, people who used money to tighten their grip around upper-class families that had fallen into financial trouble, but were still desperate to keep their glamorous appearance intact. And in the process of following their money trail, the Ellison name had appeared. Maggie went still as she listened to him explain, because the numbers he laid out matched perfectly with what she had discovered the night before. They told the rest of the story she had only known halfway. Her mother and sister, In order to have enough money to pay for their lavish lifestyle, and especially for Vanessa's showy upcoming wedding, had borrowed an enormous sum from that very ring, and what they had put up as collateral for the loan was nothing other than the shares of the company her father had left behind, the very asset they had tricked Maggie into signing away years ago. That meant that if her mother and sister could not repay the debt, and given the way they spent money, that was almost certain to happen, then that ring would swallow her father's entire legacy whole, and the last piece of memory, along with everything that should have belonged to her, would fall into the hands of people even more ruthless than her own family. Graham told her in a calm voice that he had enough power and resources to settle the matter neatly within only a few days, that he could buy back the debt, could make that ring withdraw, could place everything back in her hands without her needing to lift a finger, and he offered to do it for her. For a moment, Maggie felt the temptation of that offer, the vision of a powerful man stepping into her life and sweeping away all her suffering with a single motion of his hand. But then she remembered the image of herself through all those years, a woman always waiting for someone to come save her, and never being saved. And she understood that if she let Graham win everything back for her, then even if she recovered the assets, she would forever remain the girl standing, pressed against the wall, waiting for someone else to decide her fate. She lifted her head, looked straight into his eyes, and said that she was deeply grateful to him, that she would accept the information he had worked so hard to gather, but she could not let him fight this battle in her place, because this was her own fight, and she needed to win back what had been stolen from her with her own hands, not because of pride, but because it was the only way she could truly become the person she wanted to be. Graham watched her in silence for a long while, and instead of looking disappointed or offended as she had feared, something almost like respect appeared in his eyes. Then he nodded and said that he understood, that he would not interfere in her battle, but that he would always be there and ready to provide any information she needed, not as a rescuer, but as someone standing on the same side. Maggie accepted the folder from his hand, and when she walked out of that building with the numbers held tightly in her grasp, for the first time in her life, she felt she was no longer alone. More importantly, she felt strong enough not to have to lean on anyone. The weeks that followed became a stretch of time Maggie would later remember as the silence before the storm, long nights spent sitting alone in the small room she had temporarily rented above a laundromat, where she had moved after deciding she could no longer live under the same roof as the people who had deceived her. Every evening after her shift, she spread the pages of the files across the floor, arranged them in chronological order, and began the meticulous work her father had taught her when she was still a child, the work of tracing every dollar to see where it came from and where it disappeared. She worked beneath the weak yellow light until her eyes ached, using the old calculator and a thick notebook to keep her records. And little by little, the picture of her mother and sister's fraud became clearer and clearer beneath the numbers they had believed no one would ever be patient enough or knowledgeable enough to pull apart. She discovered how they had transferred her father's shares into a shell company, how they had withdrawn profits steadily for years while still lying to her that the company had gone bankrupt, and how they had falsified the figures to conceal the enormous debt they had borrowed from the Southern gang. Rosa Mendez, the only woman who had ever shown her kindness, became a quiet source of support during those days. She often stopped by after work with a box of hot food and a pot of coffee, sitting with Maggie in the cramped room without saying much, only silently helping her sort papers, and occasionally placing a warm hand on her shoulder when she saw that Maggie was exhausted. One night, when Maggie nearly wanted to give up, when the pile of papers before her seemed tangled beyond hope and loneliness pressed heavily against her chest, Rosa looked at her and said in her slow, low voice that her father must have been very proud to see her sitting there that night, doing the very thing he had once taught her, using the very gift he had given her to stand up and demand justice. And those words rekindled the fire inside Maggie that she had thought was almost out. Gradually, she realized that something strange was happening within her, that the deeper she immersed herself in those numbers and records, the more she felt herself coming back to life, finding again the person she had lost during 3 years of lowering her head and living as someone invisible. She was no longer the quiet waitress pressed against the wall. She was becoming again the sharp, intelligent girl who had once sat beside her father learning how to read a balance sheet, the girl her father had always believed had a mind far too keen to be wasted on pleasing other people. In the course of her investigation, Maggie was forced to go to a law office to ask about the legal procedures related to a signature obtained through deception. And there she met a lawyer named Eleanor Reyes, a sharp middle-aged woman with cropped hair and keen eyes. When Maggie explained her case clearly, laying out the numbers and evidence in an order so precise that the lawyer had to be surprised, Eleanor Reyes looked at her for a long while, then said that in all her years of practice, she had rarely met someone without professional training who could grasp a complex financial fraud case with such clarity, and she asked where Maggie had studied. Maggie only smiled and answered that her father had taught her, and Eleanor Reyes nodded, saying that with a gift like that, she was wasting her talent carrying champagne for other people, and that if Maggie wanted, she was willing to help her pursue this case to the very end. Not only because it would mean justice for her, but because she believed that someone like Maggie deserved a different life. And when Maggie left that law office with a new ally and a growing glimmer of hope, she knew the road ahead was still very long. But for the first time, she was walking it on her own feet. It was during those busy days that Maggie happened to meet a woman named Helen Carter, a widow of about 40 who lived in the apartment downstairs from the building where Maggie rented her room, someone she often crossed paths with on the stairway but had never truly spoken to. One afternoon, when Maggie came home from work, she found Helen sitting on the front steps with a stack of papers in her hands and a look of worry carved deeply into her face. And because something in that expression reminded Maggie of herself during those lonely years, she stopped and asked if something was wrong. Helen hesitated at first, then finally confessed that she was about to lose the apartment where she and her little daughter lived, because a few years earlier, after her husband died, she had signed a mortgage loan agreement with a finance company whose terms she had never fully understood, and now they were using the vague clauses inside it to demand foreclosure on her home for a reason Helen felt was deeply unfair. Maggie asked permission to look over the papers, and as her eyes moved across the crowded numbers and clauses, she realized at once that the company had buried an absurd penalty interest rate inside the contract, and had miscalculated the amount Helen truly still owed, taking advantage of her lack of financial knowledge to force her into a corner, exactly the way Maggie's own family had once taken advantage of her innocence years ago. She sat down on the steps beside Helen and began explaining each line to her in the simplest language she could, showing her where they had calculated incorrectly, where she had the right to file a complaint, and what documents she needed to request in order to prove that the amount they were demanding was wrong. Helen listened with eyes that grew wider and wider, because for the first time after so many months of living in fear and confusion, someone was willing to sit down and explain things to her with patience instead of threats, and she took Maggie's hand and said she didn't know how she could ever thank her enough. While the two women were still talking, the downstairs apartment door opened, and a little girl of about 6, with golden curls and round cheeks, came running out. It was Daisy, Helen's daughter, and the little girl smiled brightly as she took her mother's hand, then looked curiously at the stranger with the clear, unburdened eyes of a child who had never known the worries of adults. Daisy immediately took to Maggie, in the innocent way children often do with people who have warm hearts. She told Maggie that she had just finished a drawing, then ran back inside and brought out a piece of paper showing a little pink house, a bright yellow sun, and 3 people holding hands, explaining in her chirping voice that it was her mother, and now she wanted to draw Maggie in too, because Maggie was her new friend. Maggie accepted the drawing, and something tightened in her throat, because it had been far too long since anyone had given her a gift simply because they liked her, not because she was useful, not because she had done something for them, but only because she was herself. She sat there on the steps, letting little Daisy hold her finger and chatter about the colors in the picture, and she realized that helping Helen was not merely an act of kindness. It was returning something to her that she had lost long ago, the feeling that she had value, that her knowledge and intelligence could protect other people instead of merely helping her survive from one day to the next. When she said goodbye to the mother and daughter, and climbed the stairs back to her room with the small drawing in her hand, Maggie understood that she was not only fighting to reclaim what belonged to her, she was slowly becoming the person her father had always believed she would become. Someone who used her gift to bring fairness to those who had no one to protect them. One weekend evening, when Rosa stopped by Maggie's rented room with the familiar box of food, the young woman told her about Graham Holloway, about how he had offered to help her, and how he had refused to interfere when she wanted to fight for herself, and she expressed her surprise that a man so powerful and so cold could be kind to someone like her. Rosa sat in silence for a long while after hearing that name, her hands stopping halfway through arranging the food containers, and when she lifted her head, there was a distant light in her eyes that Maggie had never seen before. She said slowly that she knew the Holloway family, not Graham, but his mother, a woman named Mary Ann who had died many years ago. And then she told Maggie a story she had never told anyone. She said that many years earlier, when she had first arrived in Chicago with empty hands and not a single relative to turn to, unable to find work and with nowhere to go, she had stood on the edge of despair, and it was Mary Ann Holloway, who at the time was also only a hired woman working in the kitchens of wealthy families, a woman hardly any better off than Rosa herself, who had reached out and saved her. Rosa said Mary Ann had shared her cramped little place with her, had introduced her to her first job, had taught her how to stand firm in that cold city, and most important of all, she had taught Rosa something she carried with her for the rest of her life, that people who had once tasted the contempt and trampling of others had a sacred duty never to turn their faces away when they saw someone else suffering the same thing. Mary Ann had been a poor woman treated by the upper class she served as though she were invisible, mocked and driven away, but she had never allowed that bitterness to turn her into a cruel person. Instead, she used her own pain to become a place of support for those weaker than herself. Rosa said she owed Mary Ann her entire life, and when that woman, her benefactor, passed away, Rosa had promised herself that she would live according to what Mary Ann had taught her, that she would always reach out to those who were lonely and wounded. Then Rosa looked straight into Maggie's eyes, took the young woman's hand, and said softly that the day she first saw Maggie in the banquet kitchen, standing silently off to the side and swallowing every bitter word without anyone defending her, she had seen a shadow of her own younger self, and she knew at once that she couldn't turn away. Maggie sat frozen as she listened to that story, because she suddenly realized that the threads of fate had woven three complete strangers together, in a way so strange it was almost impossible to believe that the kindness Rosa had shown her had begun with the kindness Graham's mother had planted many years before, and that this same mother was also the reason why Graham, a man with such power, had been unable to sit still when he saw Maggie being trampled. She understood that both Rosa and Graham carried within them the same wound and the same vow, the vow that no one should have to endure the contempt they had once witnessed inflicted upon someone they loved, and that she had unknowingly stepped into the orbit of two people shaped by the same kind heart. In that moment, sitting in the small room with Rosa's warm, calloused hand holding tightly to hers, Maggie felt something she had not dared to feel in far too long, that she was not as alone in this world as she had always believed, that there were invisible threads of kindness still quietly connecting good people to one another across the years, and that now she was part of that thread. But that peace did not last long, because Maggie's quiet gathering of evidence and her visits to a lawyer had not escaped the eyes and ears of the Southern gang, the people who had invested a large sum of money into the Ellison family and had no desire for anyone to start digging up the numbers they wanted, kept buried. Late one night, when Maggie left Eleanor Reyes's law office and walked across the empty street to go home, she realized that a black car was rolling slowly along the curb behind her, and an icy feeling rose along her spine when the car stopped and two large men stepped out, blocking her path. One of them, a man with a hoarse voice and cold eyes, came closer and spoke to her in the tone of a warning wrapped in false politeness, saying that she was sticking her nose into matters that were none of her business, that there were certain sums of money and certain agreements a serving girl like her would be wise to stay far away from, and that if she kept digging through those papers, she would suffer consequences she could not foresee. He stood in her way, close enough for her to feel the threat radiating from his heavy body, and Maggie felt her heart pounding hard inside her chest, but she still forced her voice not to tremble as she answered that those papers concerned her father's assets, and she had the right to learn the truth. The man gave a sneering laugh and took another step forward, but at that exact moment, a row of glaring headlights swept across the street as several elegant cars quietly pulled up and stopped around them, and from the lead car, Graham Holloway stepped out with the calm stride of a man who had never had to hurry in his life. The air on the street changed at once. The two large men who had been aggressive only moments before suddenly froze and took a step back when they realized who had appeared, because the Holloway name in their world carried the weight of a sentence. Graham did not need to speak loudly. He only stepped forward and stood between Maggie and the two men, his eyes cold as the surface of a frozen lake, and said in a low, terrifyingly steady voice that this woman was under his protection, that anyone who touched her was touching him, and that if the Southern gang still wanted to keep doing business in this city, they should think very carefully about the price of a mistake like tonight. The two men looked at each other, then at the line of cars and Graham's people standing silently around them, and they understood that tonight they had run into a wall they could not climb over. So they quietly backed away to their black car and disappeared into the darkness without daring to say another word. When the street had fallen quiet again, Graham turned to Maggie and asked if she was all right in a voice that had softened completely, and for the first time, she saw in those usually cold eyes a sincere worry he did not try to hide. Maggie, though her heart was still pounding, lifted her head and said that she was fine, then reminded him that he had promised not to fight for her, and Graham gave a slight nod, answering that he had no intention of taking her battle away from her. He was only making sure she remained safe enough to fight it herself, because a fair fight required both sides to use reason, not threats in the dark. In that moment, standing in the empty street beneath the dim glow of the streetlights, Maggie looked at the man before her and finally understood who he truly was. Not the ruthless boss the rumors described, but a man carrying an old wound and a silent vow to shelter those who had no one to shelter them. And she realized that the protection he offered her had never been pity, but the understanding of one wounded soul reaching toward another. With the danger in the darkness stopped by Graham, Maggie was finally able to pour her whole mind into the true battle before her, the battle no one else could fight in her place, the battle of numbers and truth. For many weeks afterward, she and attorney Eleanor Reyes sat in the office until late into the night, placing every piece of evidence exactly where it belonged, rebuilding the entire story of fraud into a case so tightly constructed that there was not a single opening left to deny. Maggie did the very thing her father had once taught her to do. She let the numbers tell the truth for themselves. She traced every dollar that had been quietly moved away, compared the signature obtained through deception against the legal requirements for informed consent, and proved that the share transfer document from years earlier had been taken from her through lies and through the exploitation of a person who had just lost her father and was in a fragile state of mind. When the case was brought before the court, Catherine and Vanessa hired expensive lawyers, hoping to use money and cunning to smother the matter the way they had always done, but this time they had to face something money could not buy, the truth presented by the very person they had looked down on for so many years. Maggie stood before the court, not as a trembling waitress, but as a woman who held every number firmly in her hands, and she presented the whole case with such clarity and precision that the entire courtroom listened in respectful silence. She showed how her mother and sister had fabricated false bankruptcy records to conceal a company that was still making a profit, how they had withdrawn profits for years, and how they had used the very assets they had stolen as collateral for a shadowy loan, and every word she spoke was supported by a number, a document, a piece of evidence that could not be denied. Her mother's expensive lawyers tried to twist and bend her words, but they could not shake someone who understood her own case down to the smallest detail, because Maggie was not inventing or guessing anything. She was simply presenting what the numbers had recorded, and as her father had once said, numbers were the only things in the world that did not know how to lie. When the judge finally declared that the transfer document from years ago was invalid because it had been created on the basis of deception, and that all the shares and assets her father had left behind had to be returned to Maggie, including the small house on Lakewood Street that her mother had been planning to sell, the courtroom seemed to break open, while Maggie stood still for a moment, feeling the weight of the moment she had waited for, through 3 long years, gather inside her chest. She turned and looked at Graham, who was sitting in the back row, the man who had kept his promise not to interfere in this battle and had only been quietly present to witness it, and in his eyes she read not the pride of a patron looking at his own achievement, but the respect of one equal for another. Catherine sat frozen, her face drained white, unable for the first time in her life to find a single word to say, while Vanessa lowered her head and did not dare look at her sister. Maggie stepped out of the courthouse that afternoon beneath the gentle golden light of Chicago, and she understood that what she had just won was not only the assets or her father's house, but something far greater, the final and undeniable proof to the world and to herself that she had never been the powerless, invisible person others had tried to turn her into, that she had stood up on her own feet, fought with the very gift her father had given her, and won back everything that had been stolen from her without needing anyone to save her. A few days after the trial, Maggie returned to the house on Hartwell Avenue, one final time, not to beg or to accuse, but to close a chapter of her life that she had carried for far too long. She found her mother and sister sitting in the living room beneath a heavy atmosphere, and when she walked in, Catherine lifted her head with a face that remained cold and proud. Even though everything had collapsed around her, Maggie did not raise her voice. She only stepped forward and placed a sheet of paper on the table in front of them. It was a copy of the court's ruling, and she let it rest there in silence for a moment before saying that she had come to let them know her father's house would not be sold, that it would be kept exactly as her father would have wanted. Catherine looked at the paper, then at her daughter, and instead of an apology, she said bitterly that Maggie had humiliated the whole family in front of the public, that she should have been grateful to have been given a roof over her head all these years, instead of dragging everything into court. Maggie looked at her mother for a long time, and what surprised her was not that coldness, but the fact that it no longer hurt her the way it once had, because she was no longer waiting for love from someone who had never intended to give it to her. She answered calmly that she had not done this for revenge. She had done it because the truth deserved to be brought into the light, and that a roof built on deception had never been a real home at all. Catherine turned her face away and said nothing more, and in that frozen silence, Maggie understood that there would never be a true healing between her and her mother, that some wounds were too deep, and some people too hardened to change, and she accepted that, not with bitterness, but with the quiet peace of someone who had finally set down the burden of false hope. But when she turned to leave, Vanessa suddenly stood up, and for the first time in all those years, her sister's proud face cracked open to reveal something Maggie had never seen before, a real shame. Vanessa said in a trembling voice that she had been wrong, that she had let their mother guide her and had closed her eyes to things she knew were unfair, that she had lived her whole life in comfort, built on what should have belonged to Maggie, and had never once dared to face that truth. She said that on the night after the trial, for the first time, she had truly seen her younger sister. Not the awkward girl she had always looked down on, but a woman far stronger and more honorable than herself, and that realization had kept her awake for many nights. Maggie looked at her sister, and she did not hurry to forgive or to soothe her, because wounds carried for years could not heal from a few words alone, but she also did not close her eyes to the sincerity now opening before her. She only said softly that she had heard her, and that perhaps one day, if Vanessa truly wanted to change, there might still be a road between them, though that road would be very long and would have to begin again from the smallest steps. It was not a complete reconciliation, but it was the first crack in the icy wall that had separated the two sisters for their entire lives. A thin sliver of light, fragile but real, and when Maggie walked out of that house for the last time, she carried with her not hatred, but a calm, weightless relief, because she had spoken her own truth without needing to lower herself to the level of the people who had hurt her. That autumn, with the assets returned and her father's house safely preserved, Maggie could have chosen a life of comfort and ease, but instead, she chose a different path, the path she believed would have made her father proud. She used part of her inheritance to establish a small organization that offered free financial counseling to vulnerable women, widows, single mothers, women who had been pushed into hardship by life or by their own families and understood nothing about money, contracts, or their own rights. She placed her first office in a simple room not far from the neighborhood where she had once rented a place to live, and she gave the organization a plain name tied to what her father had once taught her, that numbers never knew how to lie, and her purpose was to teach those women how to read the truth for themselves in the numbers other people still used to deceive them. Eleanor Reyes, the attorney who had walked beside her, volunteered her spare time to provide legal support, and before long, word spread. More and more women came to Maggie's door with tangled stacks of papers and worries they had believed no one could help them untangle. One of the first cases she brought to a complete victory was the case of Helen Carter, the widowed neighbor she had met on the front steps that year. And with all her knowledge and patience, Maggie proved that the finance company had miscalculated and buried unfair clauses in the agreement, forcing them to cancel the foreclosure demand and adjust the debt back to the true amount. The day Helen received the news that her home had been safely kept, she came to Maggie's office with eyes wet with gratitude, and with her was little Daisy, the girl with golden curls, now chattering happily as she ran into the room with pure, unburdened joy. The little girl ran straight to the small yard behind the office, where Maggie had placed a few toys and a swing set, and Daisy's clear laughter rang through the air as she swung high beneath the soft golden light of the afternoon, completely unaware of the adult worries that had once weighed so heavily on her mother, simply a happy child playing on a beautiful day. Maggie stood by the window watching the little girl play, and Helen stepped beside her, took her hand, and said that because of Maggie, her daughter would still grow up in the very home where her father had once lived, and that she would never forget this kindness. Rosa Mendez, who had decided to leave her job at the catering company to work with Maggie, stood in the corner making coffee for everyone. And when she caught Maggie's eye, The two women shared a knowing smile, because they both understood that what was happening in this small room was the continuation of a thread of kindness planted many years before. The thread Graham's mother had begun, that Rosa had kept alive, and that Maggie was now passing on to others. Looking at that scene, the woman who had once stood pressed against a wall in a banquet room full of people turning their faces away, now stood in the middle of a space filled with laughter and gratitude, and Maggie understood that she had not only reclaimed her own life, she was building something larger than herself, a place where no woman would ever again have to feel invisible or powerless, a place where a person's worth would never be measured by appearance or wealth, but by kindness and the courage to stand up for what was right. 1 year had passed since that fateful night, and on a spring evening, the city of Chicago once again held a grand charity gala in the very ballroom where everything had begun. The room where Maggie had once stood, pressed against the wall with a tray of champagne in her hands, and a silent wound bleeding quietly inside her chest. But tonight, she did not enter through the service door. She walked in through the front entrance, her head held high, wearing a simple yet elegant deep blue dress she had chosen herself with money she had earned on her own, and this time, when she passed through the crowd, people no longer looked through her as if she were invisible. They turned to greet her with the respect due to the founder of an organization that had helped so many women throughout the city. Her mother was also present at that gala, and when their eyes met across the crowded room, Catherine gave a small, quiet nod. Not a reconciliation, not an apology, but a silent acknowledgement of an honest distance between two people who had wounded each other too deeply to pretend that everything was fine, and Maggie nodded back, accepting that distance exactly as it was, without trying to fill it with false things. Vanessa came to her with an awkward but sincere smile, and between the two sisters there was now something new beginning to take root. Fragile but real, nurtured by small steps and honest conversations throughout the past year. Then Graham Holloway appeared beside her, quietly as he always did, and he offered his hand, inviting her to step with him into the center of the room. Maggie looked at his hand, then into the eyes that had once been cold as cooled steel, eyes she now understood far more deeply, and she placed her hand in his, not because she needed a powerful man to lean on, because she had already proven to the whole world and to herself that she could stand firmly on her own 2 feet, but because she chose him, and she understood that there was an enormous difference between needing someone because we are weak and choosing someone because we are strong enough to know what we want. Together, they stepped into the center of the room, before the eyes of the very people who had once watched her serve and lower her head. And this time, Maggie did not look down even once, because the woman who had once been taught to become invisible had now understood a truth she would carry with her for the rest of her life, that no one can make us invisible unless we allow them to, and that a person's dignity is not something granted by others, but something we claim for ourselves through our own courage. The story of Maggie Ellison reminds us that the true worth of a human being is never found in appearance, in wealth, or in the recognition of others, but in self-respect, in wisdom, and in the courage to stand up and reclaim what belongs to us, that no matter how low life may push us, we always have the right to stop agreeing to live as someone invisible, and that the kindness we give away will always return to us in miraculous ways we never expected. If Maggie's story touched your heart, please leave a like and share it with someone who needs to hear it tonight. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you can listen to many more meaningful and compelling stories every day. How did this story make you feel? And which part moved your heart the most? Please leave a comment sharing the deepest feelings from your heart, so we can hear your thoughts. We wish everyone listening to this story abundant health, a joyful life, peace, and happiness every day. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next stories.